Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how Labour are likely to deal with the crisis of overcrowding in our prisons, but also consider what the Tories' most recent Justice Secretary, who's now no longer even an MP since the election, has been describing the problems, because the basic problem left by the Tories is a simple one to understand in terms of supply and demand. The Tories' answer to everything crime related is to simply promise longer prison sentences. And although I highlight the Tories there, past Labour governments have often done the same thing as well, because it's really easy. It's something the public go, oh yes, tougher sentences, that's what we do it. And you're dealing with the root causes of crime, working to rehabilitate offenders. That never occurs to them, and that's where it's a specific Tory problem, because even though the past Labour government said, oh yeah, tougher sentences, they also said, but also we need to deal with the root causes of crime. But for the Tories, it's always like, no, we'll just lock them up. We already do, you try telling them. Well, lock them up for longer then. Which, of course, massively increased the demand for prison places. But at the same time, didn't exactly build more prison spaces or hire enough prison or probation officers to cope. So as well as boosting demand, they also squeezed supply. And now prisons are full. We're in this position whereby both the Conservative government that's just left and the Labour government coming in are having to release a lot of prisoners after serving 40% of their sentence rather than the usual 50%. And even that's not enough. Latest news is actually prisons are going to be full again next year. So the Labour government have got to deal with it, and they've got a choice. They obviously can't allow the situation to be unresolved come the next election. So treading water like the Tories did isn't actually an option for them. The choice is they increase supply, they reduce demand, or a bit of both. But which are they going to go for? Well, we know that Labour appointed a non-MP prisons minister who is of the firm belief that we send far too many people to prison in the first place, and that quite a lot of those who should be sent to prison are sent for too long. Now, not being an MP, James Timpson didn't accept this role as part of a political career path. He accepted it because he thought he would be able to reform the prison system in line with his beliefs. The day after becoming Prime Minister, Keir Starmer said there are too many people in prison. So early on, there's this feeling that Labour intend to at least partially deal with the problem by reversing this outdated idea that we should do nothing to prevent crime, and where it inevitably arises, prison is the only way to deal with it, even though reoffending rates for ex-prisoners in Britain is high by the standards of our international neighbours. Then there's this argument, which came out recently. Someone with experience of the justice system said it costs £50,000 a year to keep someone in prison. Now, consider this from an economic point of view. Obviously, people who commit serious crimes have to go to prison. But if someone breaks the law in a way which can be punished in the community, and there's a very low risk of them doing any harmful reoffending anyway, then the difference between non-prison punishment and prison is quite large. If they're dealt with without a custodial sentence, they can still work, contributing taxes, paying their own way. If we put them in prison, the taxpayer is effectively shelling out £50,000 each year for them to be there. So it's the difference between them contributing thousands of pounds a year to the Treasury or them effectively withdrawing tens of thousands of pounds a year from the Treasury. Now, if they need to be there to keep innocents safe, we have to accept that cost. But would the public really be all that supportive of the idea of putting, say, someone who stole a packet of biscuits in prison, for example, if it's costing so much in extra taxes? Because this is the problem I have. In polling in general, people will say, oh, do you support this and do you support that? And very often the polling doesn't say, but this is what you also have to accept, the cost to it, the downside. The same person then said that the actually building more prison capacity was no cheap measure either. So building new prisons, for each individual prison place you will build, it costs an extra £600,000. So that's not for a prison, that's for a prison space. So if the government wanted to build more prisons, not only would it need to spend more on hiring and training a lot more prison staff, and then of course probation officers for the other end of things, but tens of millions on each new prison. And this person said, look, we can't just lock up everyone we're cross with. And who was this person? Alex Chalk. Until recently, the Justice Secretary in the Conservative government, in charge of prisons. The same government which responded to any concerns about crime by saying they would just beef up prison sentences. So the previous Justice Secretary believes the problem is that we actually send too many people to prison. And even some of the people who should go to prison are going for far too long. In other words, the most recent Tory in charge of prisons did not believe in the policies he was defending whilst in post, which I'm not going to call out as an example of hypocrisy because it's not really true. Ministers can't just do their own thing. They have to work within the boundaries set by the Prime Minister. Sometimes a minister will take up a position in order to try to make the best of a bad job. Now, why I highlight this is it shows that there are actually pragmatic arguments to be made that will work on the right wing about this as well. After all, the arguments about cost should resonate with people on the right. The people who don't like the idea of lots of excessive public spending. The reason why successive governments like to talk about tougher sentencing, and as I say, it's something the previous Labour government have done as well, it's because it wins broad support from the British public. But has anyone ever considered that perhaps this is because nobody ever suggests alternative, and certainly nobody ever talks about the costs? Do you support this even though it would cost that? Like, tell people when you poll them about whether they support tougher sentence for a particular offence, work out the cost and say, do you support it even though it'll cost this much extra in taxes? Because the polls never do that, do they? Do you still support it with this cost attached to it? And the cost to the Treasury of building more prison places and the running costs of accommodating the prisoners is only part of the financial cost because they're not working. It means that there's a hit to our GDP as well. And if you don't want that hit to GDP, if you want a worker to do that same job, we don't have enough workers, what we're going to do? Oh, we're going to need more immigration because, the public are totally on board with that. There are nearly 90,000 people in prison in England and Wales right now. If about a third of them shouldn't be there in the first place and another third are there for too long, then that's arguably about £3 billion a year we're spending by having people in prison for no benefit to society. A year. That's just running costs, not the cost of building more prison places or counting the cost to national productivity. This is money which does nothing to reduce crime. It's just wasted on political distractions, because that's all talk of tougher sentences is, really. It's an easy way of diverting the conversation away from more difficult issues. Because what the questions that politicians should be asked is, so why are these crimes committed in the first place? Why shouldn't we prevent the crimes? How the government could change things to reduce the chance of people breaking the law. Because apart from anything else, that would mean having to have a frank discussion about poverty, racism, misogyny in many cases. And perhaps it's these arguments which Labour could employ when at some point it starts to announce the policies with which it's going to tackle the crisis of prison overcrowding. Because when asked about the early prisoner release programme, for example, Starmer over the last few weeks has kept saying, well, I can't build a new prison by this Saturday. It's like, no. But when we're a year down the line or a couple of years down the line, by that point, he will have had time to build new prisons. And if he intends to solve the problem by just boosting prison capacity, then he's going to have to order the building of those new prisons, as well as the hiring and training of much more staff. And the longer that's delayed, the more the solution surely is resting on reducing the prison population in the first place. Now, being clear, Labour have committed to building more prison capacity. I think the figure in the manifesto was 20,000 places. They've also promised to introduce programmes aimed at reducing reoffending rates, as well as some moves aimed at reducing the initial offending rates in the first place. But they do still have a prisons minister who thinks too many people are sent to prison, and now a Tory Justice Secretary who thinks the same. If presented correctly, Labour looks like it could have the tools to persuade the public that actually tougher sentencing is not the answer after all, and it comes with a hefty cost. I guess the only small flaw in this plan is that Labour are monumentally bad at presenting arguments. For example, one argument I might like to make if they'd want to push this is to say, well, if we take the view that tougher sentencing is costing twice as much as the winter fuel payments issue, because that's, they're getting into a bit of a mess over that. That's partly why it's evidence that their messaging is really bad. They aim to save about £1.5 billion from making winter fuel payments means tested. And if we're saying you could easily come up with an argument that it's costing an extra £3 billion a year to have people in prison who shouldn't actually be in prison. So if you say to them, well, if we didn't have this excessive number of people in prison, then we'd be able to afford 2 lots of winter fuel payments. That's a bit of an argument, isn't it? Present those arguments to the public. Because when you present the argument, oh, should we just lock these people up for longer? People who feel unsafe at the idea of criminality will go, yeah, we'll lock them up for longer, then there's fewer criminals. Whereas say to them, but there are some people who you know, shouldn't really be there and it's costing you an extra £3 billion a year. Are you happy with that? And if they say, yeah, oh, so then that's fine. We'll just have to make the cuts from, for example, winter fuel payments. Those sort of arguments, they just don't seem to make them, do they? But anyway, there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.